to the Metro on 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. II. Detroit police announced in the summer plans to ramp up their enforcement of the city's curfew policy. It's in response to a string of shootings in Detroit that occurred within a single week. During that time, 3 teens and a 4-year-old were killed. 3 other teenagers were either hit or injured in the shootings. The city already has fines for parents of teenagers who stay out past curfew hours without adult supervision. And within a week of those shootings, Mayor Mike Duggan and Police Chief Todd Bettison announced a plan to increase the curfew penalty. The fee for first-time offenses went from $75 to $250. And for second-time offenses, it increased from $100 to $500. And officials say that this will encourage parents to help mitigate the violence. However, experts argue that there's little evidence to this approach. They say that these policies could actually cause more hardship for families. So we want to know what you think. Are stiffer curfew fines the right approach? And what role do you take as a parent or guardian to keep the young people in your family out of trouble? The phone lines are open. You can call us at 313-577-1019. We want to hear your thoughts on this issue. Caitlin Cavanaugh is a developmental psychologist who teaches in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. She joins me now to discuss what the impact of this curfew could have and how this spotlights an important developmental stage for teenagers and the possible alternative solutions that we could probably see outside of this curfew. Professor Cavanaugh, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me, Kerry. It's an honor to be here.
Thank you. So you don't feel this curfew reduces youth behavior. Tell us why.
Sure. So when it comes to the curfew, there was actually recently what's called a systematic review, which means that somebody, a researcher, goes through all of the research that exists out there on curfews and aggregates it to say, okay, what's the overall picture that we're seeing here? And there's really not much evidence that curfews reduce crime among teenagers.
And so it's simple as just aggregating all of the instances that it doesn't do it. Is there, because the idea behind it is, we'll penalize these parents so that they will step up and be accountable to their kids. The logic, at least on first thought, makes sense, but doesn't actually bear out. What's the evidence to say that it doesn't? Why wouldn't that work?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what's interesting about juvenile crime is that it's the only instance of crime where somebody else might be held responsible. So if an adult commits a crime, that adult is the only person who's held responsible. Your parent, your sibling, your partner is now also going to get in trouble if you as an adult commit a crime. But juvenile crime is a little bit different, and that's because since children are minors, we have an expectation that parents are there to guide them, to support them, and to help enforce rules. So what that means is across the U.S., there are lots of different ways that parents can be held responsible when their youth commit a crime. Most of those penalties are civil, so that's what we're talking about with fines and fees. That's a civil penalty where the parents then have to pay a fine or a fee for their child's wrongdoing. Some parents in some places can also be held criminally responsible for their children's wrongdoing. A case that a lot of listeners might be familiar with is the Crumley case. So Ethan Crumley was a school shooter in Michigan and Oxford, and his parents were then found criminally responsible. So there are many ways that parents can and are held responsible legally for when their children commit crimes. The issue is that fines and fees oftentimes amplify disadvantages that parents are already facing. So we know that the youth who are more likely to get arrested tend to come from more disadvantaged backgrounds. What I mean by that is that they tend to be from families with fewer economic resources, fewer social resources. Those are the sorts of kids who are disproportionately likely to get involved in the justice system. So you can imagine if you are a parent who is struggling, especially in the current economic situation, struggling to keep food on the table, struggling to pay rent, you may be working a night shift. You may be taking on additional jobs to make sure that you can support your family. And in that case, no matter how much you might want to monitor your children's behavior, you're simply not in the house at that time to be able to do it.
Mhm.
For many listeners, maybe you remember being a teenager, maybe you've been the parent of a teenager, and so you know that teenagers are very interested in kind of risk-taking, sensation-seeking, going against the grain, rebellion, right? And so if you are a parent who needs to work a night shift or has been assigned to work a night shift, you can tell your teenager,
Right.
listen, you need to be home by curfew. But if, if you're not there to enforce that, that's very difficult.
Who
And so
knows
the
what they might
very
be up to?
families, yes, exactly. So the very families who are already oftentimes struggling financially are
Mm,
then hit with this additional fee.
mm,
And the increase from $75 to $250, for
right.
some families, $250, that's an enormous sum of money. And really difficult decisions then might need to be made in the family's finances in order to pay that fee, which of course does not set the family up for success. If a family is already struggling financially,
Yeah.
now they've got this additional fine, this additional kind of financial hit that they're taking, then that family is going to be even less able to provide that stable environment for the children that we know helps prevent crime.
I want to, because when I hear, oh, that fine is very really expensive, the thought process might be, hey, this is to deter. The point is not to actually fine them, it's to say, hey, you don't want to get this fine, so you ought to step up and make sure your child is in the home or where they're supposed to be, or not doing things that they shouldn't be doing. But the important part of what you just said is some parents don't have the resources or the time to actually do that. And that's where the gap kind of might fit, right? So there,
Yes,
mhm,
exactly. So I've been doing interviews with the parents of youth who have been arrested for almost 15 years now. And one thing that I hear over and over again, it's not that parents don't want to be able to be good parents or don't care about their kids. It's that there are often these outside barriers and challenges that prevent them from being able to be the parent that they want to be.
mm,
So they might know that, yes, in the ideal situation, I'm home to greet my child when they come home from school, and I'm helping them with their homework, and we've got a beautiful meal on the table, and we all read a story before bedtime. But that is not the reality for a lot of families, particularly from disadvantaged communities. As much as they might be striving for that, there are simply systemic barriers, financial barriers, that prevent that from being the case. And so a deterrent in that case is not necessarily going to work on the parent, because if they could, they already would.
yeah, they
Um,
already have that
and
motivation.
yeah, absolutely. Another interesting point I want to make about deterrence is that deterrence we know is foundational in the adult criminal justice system. So there's this idea that by saying, here is the punishment that you will get if you do this crime, then people will not want to do the crime because they don't want to face that punishment. That's what deterrence means. And in the adult criminal justice system, that makes a lot of sense. But teenagers are qualitatively different from adults in the
Mm,
way that their brains work. So some listeners may have heard that teenagers' brains don't stop developing until they're about 25 years old. And those changes that are happening in the brain during the teenage years mean that teenagers, compared to adults, are really bad at thinking about the consequences of their actions.
mm,
It's not that they're stupid, it's not that they are trying to be jerks. It's that the way that their brains are set up, the parts of their brains that have developed and the parts of their brains that have not yet developed, mean that they really don't have the capacity to think about consequences in the same way that adults do. So if deterrence as a concept relies on the idea that people know what the consequence is going to be and then they behave accordingly, that doesn't really work on teenagers, because they have a really difficult time thinking through the consequences, especially they are in that kind of sensation seeking, rebellious, let's go do something fun and new and different mode. They're not thinking about the consequences. So that deterrent effect that we see in the adult criminal justice system really doesn't have much of an effect when it comes to teenagers.
I see. I see. You're listening to the Metro 1019 WDET. I'm Kerry Jr. the second. Call the number 313-577-1019. We're talking about the city's increase in curfew fines. What do you think? Are stiffer curfew fines the right approach here? We want to hear what our listeners think about this subject. And I want to ask a question and follow up with you, Professor Kavanaugh, because you just brought up an interesting point in that we understand that young people aren't going to process, okay, there's a penalty associated with the deed that I did. We're expecting, I guess, the parent to understand that and then discipline the child. But then that requires the relationship between the child and the parent to be in a place where the parent can work. Like, there's two actors in this. But at the same time, we know that the child has agency. They have their own agency. They may still go out when you say don't go out. Like, it's like we're balancing two things at once here, right? Like, we can't depend on the child necessarily to understand the punishment because they're young, but at the same time, we know that they have their own agency to do things that may not fall under what the parent said they would do. And so it's like we have to account for so many different variables, which make this a very convoluted thing, and maybe understandably goes to the point of why one blanket curfew may not be the solution to fix all of this.
Yeah, that's a great point. There's a few other things about adolescent development that I think are relevant here. So adolescence is a time when kids are figuring out who they are. They're developing an identity, and that's a good thing. We want kids to be able to kind of stand on their own two feet, know who they are, so that as they're transitioning into adulthood, as they're reaching their 20s, they have a firm sense of, this is who I am. These are my values. This is what I'm like as a person.
Mm-hmm.
And so fostering that identity development and independence during the teenage years is actually really important and really positive. And so you can imagine a world where we have these really draconian curfew laws, and so every child has to be in their home at 8 o'clock. That's going to make it really difficult for kids to practice that decision making on their own, to practice that independence, to practice that identity development. And so I don't think it's the case that a blanket curfew is going to be helpful in moving children towards preparing them for this adult future where they know who they are, they're able to make independent decisions.
I see. At a press conference, I want to talk a little bit more about just this curfew law, and then we're going to get to development after the break. At the press conference where they announced these curfew fines, Detroit Mayor Mike Duggan and Police Chief Todd Bettison, they both emphasized the role of parents. Here's a little bit about what they said.
We need you to step up. We need you to ensure that you know where your kids are.
Generations of Detroiters were raised in this town to be told when the street lights come on, you come home. We have got to get more help from parents.
What I want to know from you, Professor Kavanaugh, is the role that parents do play. What influence do they actually have in these young people's lives? Because we do know sentimentally that, you know, parents, we hold parents accountable for when someone's really young to behave. What is that role like, and what kind of influence do parents actually have on young people's ability to kind of be shaped into someone who knows right from wrong?
Yeah, great question. So parents actually matter a lot. I feel like there's a common stereotype that teenagers don't care what their parents think, don't listen to their parents. That's actually not true. What the research suggests is that adolescents are very much still taking in the attitudes and values of their parents. And in fact, we know that parental involvement in children's lives is one of the best predictors of those kids not getting involved in crime. So the parents who know what children are up to, they kind of know who their friends are, how they're spending their free time, those children are less likely to end up getting arrested or get in dangerous situations. So it's absolutely true that there's a role for parents here. If you're a parent who's listening and you're thinking, oh, it's a lost cause, my teenager doesn't care what I say, just know that the research does not bear that out. That's not true. And it is very important for parents to understand what their children are doing, who their friends are, where they're spending their time.
Mm. In that press conference as well, Mayor Duggan stressed that the fines are to deter the children from committing crime. You spoke earlier about how young people themselves won't be able to understand the consequences of their actions. But oftentimes we hear about deterrence, as you said before, or police trying to step in to prevent or stop crime before it happens. What is a police department's ability to prevent crime? What should prevention really look like if something like a fee doesn't work?
Yeah, great question. So there's actually a really great model for this in Baltimore that is unfolding right now. So I'm going to back it up a little bit. I hope I'm not getting ahead of myself here. But as I was talking about before, adolescents are qualitatively different than adults. Their brains do not work the same. The way they make decisions is not the same. That's been recognized by the US Supreme Court and decades of neuroscience research. And part of what that means is youth are really driven toward sensation seeking, which means an exciting new experience, and risk taking, which means, trying something new. Kids are really driven toward that. And so if we don't want kids to engage in crime, we need to give them alternatives where they can flex those sensation-seeking, risk-taking muscles in a way that is pro-social rather than criminal. So in Baltimore right now, the city has funneled a lot of money, not necessarily into enforcement, but rather into providing those sorts of pro-social opportunities for kids to do something new and fun and exciting and social. We know that teenagers love hanging out with friends. That's a really important part of their social development. That's a good thing. But we need to find ways as a community to make sure that they have those positive opportunities, positive outlets, so that they can engage in that fun, risk-taking, I'm out with friends, I'm doing something new in a way that is positive.
All right, we're going to take a break right here. And when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Professor Kavanaugh about the research that suggests that teenagers need to engage in risk-taking behavior to develop. You've already nodded at that, Professor Kavanaugh. We'll discuss more about that after the break. Also, the phone lines are open, folks. We want to hear what you think. Should we increase the financial penalty for families? What role do you as a parent or a guardian take to keep young people in your life out of trouble? Call 313-577-1019. We'll be right back. Listening to the Metro on 1019 WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Kerry Jr. II. After a string of tragic shootings over the summer, Detroit officials announced that they're increasing the curfew penalty. Experts say that does not solve the problem. In fact, teenagers need some sort of risk-taking behavior to develop properly. Caitlin Kavanaugh joins me to discuss all of that. She's a developmental psychologist who teaches in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Professor Kavanaugh, you've mentioned this earlier in the conversation, but I want to come back to it now. Teenagers being at this crucial stage where they're not only prone to engage in risky behavior, but that is necessary for them. Can you just talk more about that and really define what risk-taking behavior is?
Sure. So risk-taking can look like a lot of things for a lot of different kids. I was mentioning before that one policy alternative is to offer pro-social opportunities for risk-taking. And what that means in practice is things like you can take a risk on the sports field, right? You can take a risk by joining the drama club and you're putting yourself out there. There are many ways that kids can take quote-unquote risks that aren't necessarily law-breaking. And the reason that risk-taking is so important, first of all, teenagers have a natural drive toward it due to their brain development, but also it aids in that identity development. It aids in that being prepared to enter adult society. We want children to be able to enter adult society and feel comfortable getting outside their comfort zone a little bit. We want them to feel comfortable with new and different experiences. And that's why the teenage brain sets kids up to learn those skills. Through the way that it's organized. So that's what we mean when we talk about risk taking. It's just a matter of making sure that the parameters around what kind of behavior kids can engage in are supporting that natural drive toward risk taking, but not in a way that's criminal. So if there are no options for kids, if funding is cut for extracurriculars and there's no other opportunities for kids to engage in that sensation-seeking risk taking, then naturally they're going to have to move toward illegal means of stretching that muscle, of meeting that need, because there aren't any other options for them.
That's interesting. Now, I will say, based off of some of your examples, as a former band and theater kid, I do remember the rush of live performance. I didn't think of it, though, as risk-taking behavior, though, I'm learning something new today. But I along with, I feel like other people would think, okay, performing a concert or being on a sports field is different from, engaging in illegal behavior. Now, you just said that it could lead to that. I'm really wanting you to draw that out for me. How do we get from, wanting to perform or be good at a sport or the pressure of the moment at a particular sport to illegal behavior? What determines that? Are there factors at play here?
So really, I would just think of this as the buffet of options that are available to kids. So if the buffet of options that are available to kids are really limited, then there's not a lot of opportunities for them to engage in that sensation seeking, that risk taking that aren't criminal. And we've seen that in many communities across the country where funding is cut for various city-run programs or school-based programs, after-school programs, et cetera. Once that funding is gone, kids don't have that outlet anymore. That's not to say that kids who are on a sports team are never going to commit a crime. We know that that's not true. There are many, many reasons why kids end up committing crimes. However, in terms of policy alternatives, one of the most promising that the research suggests is just providing a more positive outlet for that natural tendency toward risk-taking.
What happens if teens aren't able to engage in risk-taking behavior at that key developmental stage?
They'll find a way to do it. That's what it comes down to. And if they're truly not able to, if they are kept in a bubble, so to speak, then there are concerns that when they enter the adult world, they won't be able to contribute to the workforce. We know that in the workforce, a lot of times you've got to stand up for yourself. You've got to make a challenging decision. You've got to make the call that's a little bit hard to make. We know that those sorts of things come up in the workplace. And if children aren't prepared to do that, then our whole economy can suffer.
How does a teenager's environment, you kind of mentioned before that the options that young people have available to them will kind of dictate where they can go to engage in that risk-taking behavior. But I'm thinking more about the people they spend their time with. How does that determine the kinds of risk-taking behavior they engage in?
Yeah, absolutely. So kids are really driven towards social interactions, particularly with peers. So kids about their same age, maybe a little bit older. Kids are really, really drawn to those social interactions, again, because of their natural brain development. And so if the folks that kids are surrounding themselves with are what's called criminogenic, or kind of involved in crime, involved in delinquent behavior, then that is going to become socially normative for that child. So if all your friends are kind of involved in this behavior, that's going to seem like just the normal fun thing that your friend group does. And so we see oftentimes that's how we see these kind of cells of kids who to them it feels normal. And I think that is where some of the more serious violence comes in, because I do not at all want to downplay the serious violence that Detroit and many communities have seen in recent years, right? That is a serious issue. But you can imagine if you are a teenager, you're looking for something new and risky and interesting, and everyone who you're kind of surrounded with is already engaging in some kind of low-level crime, then that doesn't feel risky anymore, right?
Mm.
That doesn't
It's like
feel
normalized.
sensation seeking. Yeah, it's totally normalized. And so you've got to up the ante. And so what's exciting? What's risk taking? What's sensation seeking? Involving a gun, right? And so that's where we see sometimes violence escalating, is because if there's already kind of like a baseline layer of crime or of delinquency in a particular community, then we can see why kids would be kind of attracted to, well, what's the next level of excitement? Because this is just normal to me.
Professor Kavanaugh, you've already outlined that you believe additional recreational activities are a way for us to mitigate some of this violence, give young people something to do that allows them to engage in this risk-taking behavior that doesn't have serious consequences. It already sounds like something like that falls outside of the jurisdiction of a police department. And when it comes to this case with these crimes, with these curfew fees, they're the ones who are at least looked at as the person to solve this problem. When shootings happen, people look to the police to solve it. But is it fair to say that this may be a problem in which the solution isn't for the police to address on their own?
Absolutely. That's definitely true. We are a community, and if as a community we care about reducing youth crime, then we need to show that value through where we devote resources. It's not necessarily just up to law enforcement to prevent crime. We know that a lot of prevention happens in the community and what resources are available. And I want to highlight also, there is still a role for parents here. I don't want to make it sound like there's no role for parents, but rather than finding ways to punish parents, it would be more effective if communities could find ways to support parents. So if parents are already struggling, what supports can be put in place so that those disadvantaged families feel a little bit more stability, so that those parents can be the excellent parent that they are striving to be.
All right. Caitlin Kavanaugh is a developmental psychologist who teaches in the School of Criminal Justice at Michigan State University. Professor Kavanaugh, thank you very much for shedding light on this conversation and for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you so much, Carrie.
All right, coming up, a landmark home that played a really crucial role in the Selma Montgomery marches is coming to Greenfield Village in Dearborn. We'll hear all about that next on the Metro. Stay right there. We'll be right back.